What if the very thing meant to protect America is the thing that could destroy it? Donald Trump's nationalist agenda has been hailed as a bold defense of American sovereignty. But is it also a direct threat to democracy? Across history, nationalism has been used to unite nations, but also to dismantle them. With democracy already under strain, polarized elections, attacks on institutions, and growing authoritarian trends, could this nationalist movement be the tipping point toward something far more dangerous? What does it mean for voter rights, freedom of speech, and the future of the republic? And more importantly, is this a movement to restore America or to reshape it into something unrecognizable? Stay with me, because what we uncover today could change the way you see the future of democracy. In this video, we're going to continue the discussion about Donald Trump and nationalism. Let's start with the definition of nationalism. Nationalism is a political ideology that emphasizes national sovereignty, cultural identity, and self-determination. Nationalism prioritizes the interests of the nation instead of globalism or foreign influence. To start out, let's look at the core principles of nationalism. Number one is the principle of national sovereignty. What do we mean by national sovereignty? National sovereignty means a strong, independent state with minimal outside interference. What's the second core principle of nationalism? The second principle is cultural unity. What's that? Cultural unity is an emphasis on shared traditions, language, and history. If you think about it, this is a difficult principle in the United States of America because our population has historically been made up of many different cultures and cultural identities. The third core principle of nationalism is patriotism. That almost seems like a bad word today, doesn't it? But it's not. Patriotism is simply loyalty and pride in one's country. It isn't an evil and bad term by itself. And finally, the fourth core principle of nationalism is economic and political self-sufficiency. And what this means is prioritizing domestic industry and national interests and not being dependent on other nations. I remember as a young man being concerned that our country would ever be dependent on another country for its basic resources and its basic survival needs. I always thought that our country and every other country should be self-sufficient in order to feed and clothe and house their own people. What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments below. So given these four principles of nationalism, we ask the question, is Donald Trump a nationalist? And the answer is pretty clear. Yes, Donald Trump is a nationalist. Donald Trump is openly identified as a nationalist, particularly during his first term as president from 2017 to 2021. At a 2018 rally in Houston, Texas, Trump said, quote, "You know, they have a word. It's called nationalist." And I say, really? We're not supposed to use that word? But you know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. This statement marked a clear rejection of globalism, emphasizing national sovereignty, strong borders, and economic self-interest. Rejection of globalism is easy to say, but what does it mean? What is globalism? Globalism, or internationalism, is a belief in global cooperation, interconnected economies, and international governance structures to address global issues. Another way of putting it is this: it's not just every man for himself. While nationalism prioritizes sovereignty, globalism seeks cooperation across national boundaries. Donald Trump is a nationalist. However, the type of nationalism he promotes is not traditional ethnic nationalism, but rather a form of economic, populist, and America First nationalism. Let's go into detail on the differences between those. First of all, economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is prioritizing domestic industries, protecting jobs from foreign competition, and reducing reliance on international trade. Why would we want this kind of nationalism? Well, going back to what I said previously about my youth, I was always scared of America being dependent on somebody else for what we basically needed to survive. And economic nationalism would help us to be more self-sufficient and not dependent on other nations for our survival needs. Next is populist nationalism. What is that? It's a people-first movement that rejects political elites, globalization, and multiculturalism in favor of national identity and working class interests. Now, in order to put populist nationalism in perspective, we need to take a look at the opposites and alternatives to populist nationalism. And if this surprises you, let me know in the comments below, because it sure did surprise me. It seems there are not just one, but there are several opposites to populist nationalism, depending on what aspect you focus on. For example, you could focus on the structure. That means the opposite of populist nationalism, when you focus on the structure, is elitism. And what is elitism? Elitism is rule by the few. In other words, there's a few people up here at the top, and they're the ones who rule, and everybody else underneath them just follows what they say. A second opposite to populist nationalism is when you focus on decision-making. In that case, you have what's called a technocracy. What's a technocracy? A technocracy is rule by experts. In other words, instead of everybody getting together and deciding how we're going to rule, what kind of laws we're going to make, and what we're going to expect each other to do, we have some experts who do that for us. I think the most recent example we had of that was during the pandemic just a few years ago, when we were told to trust the science, as if we didn't need to or we shouldn't question anything, because the experts, the technical people, the scientists had determined the truth for us. So that's what it means to have a technocracy. We're ruled by the experts. A third perspective that stands in opposition to populist nationalism is political philosophy. If you are opposed to populist nationalism, then you can have institutionalism, where you trust in laws and processes. And really, that's the way we do things in the United States today, or we have been doing it before now. We had agencies. We had institutions. We had people who were elected to federal positions, and as they worked together, their institutions were the ones who guided what went on in our country. And you may remember we mentioned earlier that populist nationalism was a rejection of globalism. So, if you're going to look for an opposite to nationalism versus globalism, then the opposite is globalism, which, as we said, was international cooperation. Now, the thing you have to understand about this international cooperation means that no one country is their own authority. We have to get the group of nations together, and the power and the authority comes from the group of nations rather than the individual nation. And then, if you take a look at the aspect of economic and social governance, the opposite of populist nationalism is classic liberalism, which kind of goes along with opposition to globalism. Classical liberalism emphasizes individual freedom over collective movements. And what does this mean in practical terms? It means that instead of individual freedom being on the front burner, it's the collective group of nations who make the decisions that everyone else has to live by. And the question we have to ask ourselves, is that the way we want to live? And then the final form of nationalism that is identified with Donald Trump is civic nationalism, or patriotism, a non-racial form of nationalism that emphasizes national pride, loyalty, and American exceptionalism. And just for clarity's sake, I think we need to take a look at the definition and origins of the term American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is unique, distinct, or superior compared to other nations, particularly in its values, political system, and historical mission. The concept traces back to Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political thinker, who in his 1835 book, Democracy in America, described the U.S. as a nation unlike any other because of its democratic institutions, individualism, and civic culture. Did you know that the term American exceptionalism didn't originate in America? That it came from France? Let me know if you did or didn't know that down in the comments below. Also, another thing that took me by surprise is it was coined in 1835. So Alexis de Tocqueville was looking at an America that we never have seen in our lives. He coined this phrase 25 years before the Civil War, when the black population was still enslaved, and he said it before the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century and before 2 world wars. So no matter how accurate the phrase may or may not have been at that time, that doesn't mean it's still true today, because there's a lot of issues that we need to resolve in our current society and culture. Trump's nationalism does not fully align with extreme ethnic nationalism, for example, white nationalism or white supremacy, but it has attracted elements of those people. So what are some of the concerns concerning Trump's nationalism? First, there is the erosion of democratic norms. What do we mean by that? Trump's rhetoric and actions have challenged foundational democratic norms, raising alarms about undermining essential checks and balances. Such behavior can weaken public trust in democratic institutions and erode the norms that sustain a healthy democracy. What's another concern regarding Trump's nationalism? The expansion of executive power. Trump's administration has been noted for attempts to consolidate executive power, sometimes bypassing traditional legislative processes. For example, the use of executive orders to implement significant policy changes without congressional approval has been viewed as an overreach of presidential authority, potentially upsetting the balance of power that is crucial in a democratic system. Third, Trump's nationalism carries risks of polarization and social division. The nationalist agenda has been associated with increased societal polarization. Emphasizing us versus them narratives can deepen divisions among different social, ethnic, and political groups. This polarization can lead to a fragmented society, where consensus building becomes challenging, thereby hindering effective democratic governance. Finally, one of the concerns regarding Trump's nationalism is the undermining of electoral integrity. Allegations of voter suppression, dissemination of misinformation regarding election outcomes, and reluctance to commit to peaceful transfers of power are seen as direct threats to the democratic principle of free and fair elections. And I'm not saying these views are held by everyone, but they are concerns that have been raised by at least one side of the argument. And finally, in the list of concerns regarding Trump's nationalism is international relations and democratic alliances. Trump's nationalist policies have sometimes strained relationships with traditional democratic allies. By adopting an America First stance, there is a risk of alienating other democratic nations, weakening global coalitions that promote and protect democratic values worldwide. Let me know whether or not you agree with all of these concerns down in the comments below. So those are some of the major lists of concerns regarding Trump's nationalism. However, there are some counter-arguments to those concerns that need to be considered. For example, supporters of Trump's nationalist agenda argue that prioritizing national interests is essential for safeguarding the country's sovereignty and ensuring that government policies reflect the will of its citizens. Now, quite frankly, this argument seems a little bit ironic given the pushback against the authoritarianism that Trump has demonstrated in the first month or so that he's been in office the second time. But the people who follow this line of thinking contend that such an approach can revitalize national pride and address issues neglected by previous administrations. And all I can say about that is nobody in politics bats 1,000. So what conclusion can we draw from these concerns and counter-arguments regarding Trump's nationalism? Well, nationalism in itself is not inherently anti-democratic. The manner in which it is implemented can have significant implications for democratic governance. In the case of Trump's nationalist agenda, concerns about the erosion of democratic norms, expansion of executive power, societal polarization, threats to electoral integrity, and strained international relations suggest potential risks to democracy. It is crucial for citizens and institutions to remain vigilant and ensure that the pursuit of national interests does not come at the expense of democratic principles. Next up, is Donald Trump a Christian nationalist? We continue that discussion in this video here. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you can receive notifications when we launch future videos. Also, consider supporting this channel through the Buy Me a Coffee app in the link below. There's also some affiliate links that you might be interested in, especially if you're interested in being a YouTube creator. So let's go on to the next video.